الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. قال الله تعالى في شان حبيبي إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه على سيدنا مولانا محمد المبارك صلى الله عليه صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. Last couple of weeks we've been talking about the connection between the verses of Surah Kahf and dajjaal. And in the last part of the first 10 verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins talking about the people of the cave. He says, أَمْ حَسِبْتَ أَنَّ أَصْحَابَ الْكَهْفِ وَالرَّقِيمِ كَانُوا مِنْ آيَاتِنَا عَجَبًا. Do you consider, and again this is a rhetorical question, do you think or do you consider the story of the people of the cave and the inscription as something strange? And when it's a rhetorical question, it means, yeah, this isn't strange. You might think it's strange, but it's not strange. And part of that, as we mentioned, when we look at the people of the cave, they run away from the king, they go into the cave, they worship Allah, and then one night they go to sleep, and they wake up 300 years later, or lunar 309 years later. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he told us about Dajjal. He said that Dajjal will be here for 40 days. But he said that the first day will be like a year. The second day will be like a month. The third day will be like a week. And then he says, and the rest of the days will be like your days. So we see, again, this analogy with the people of the cave and the 300 years that they slept. Even though they weren't in the presence of the people, living around them, they're still there. And their legend was also still there. And there was talk about these boys that disappeared and no one knew what happened to them, who ran away from the king because they wanted to worship Allah. So we see the fitna of Dajjal all around us already. Even though we don't see him physically. You see all of these plans being made. If you follow the global politics a little bit, they have the Agenda 2030. And it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you talk to, they all have an Agenda 2030. For some reason, that year, 2030. But if you look at all these agendas that they've been fulfilling over time, everything is designed to take us away from the true love of Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Every agenda that they put forward is like now it's more blatantly obvious, and still people don't see it. But when you look at like the UN and all of the non-governmental agencies that do their thing, and the agendas of the UN and even the various groups that the UN is funding, that the UN has propped up, irregardless of whether even it's medical, the World Health Organization. If you look at how they do things, if you look at where they do things, you start to see this trend again. And the trend, the basics of the trend is to take people away from the love of Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You look at the individual governments that are ruling. Each one, if you really start analyzing them, you realize that the agendas are all the same. You know, it's like here. People think that there's a difference between one party and the other party, and there's not, because the agendas never change. You know? So when we look at this fitna of Dajjal, and there are some people who draw this analogy that a day like a year in the hereafter is 1,000 years. A month in the hereafter would be 83 and a third years. A week in the hereafter would be approximately 20 years, our time. But then the other 37 days will be our days. So if you look at the beginning of the fitna and how all of these agendas have unfolded, or are unfolding rather, and how they've shifted, you know, to accommodate for whatever changes have taken place within society, you start realizing all these patterns. So it shouldn't surprise us, just like, you know, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the sleep of these people of the cave is nothing unusual. You know, 300 years is nothing. So the same way the fitna of Dajjal making its ways through society over all of these years and slowly growing and growing and getting stronger should not be unusual for us. You know, we should already be alert to it. So when, you know, when it confronts us, which it's doing all the time, it shouldn't throw us off balance. You know, we shouldn't be surprised by it, because it's nothing strange for us. It should not be anything strange for us. Because again, this gets back to that aspect where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that fear the sight of a mu'min, because he sees through the nur of Allah. You know, things are very plain and apparent to him, which other people can't see. This is also why, as we mentioned last week, you know, Kafir will be written on the forehead of Dajjal when he comes. Even the fitna itself, for those who see, becomes very apparent. But when he comes, it's going to be written, disbeliever, Kafir. And Kafir is from Kafara, which is to hide the truth. This is why a Kafir is a Kafir, because he hides the truth of the prophethood of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this, for the believer, he will see this, irregardless of whether he even knows how to read or write. He will still see it and still know what it says. Because he's not looking at it with regular eyes. He's looking at it through the nur of Allah. And so when you start seeing these analogies, or start, you know, kind of comprehending some of the analogies, especially between the story of the people of the cave and the fitna of Dajjal, and what the people will have to do in order to protect themselves from that fitna. What did the young men do? They didn't say that, oh, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, because they knew if they keep doing what they're doing at that time, you know, the oppression of the king will eventually take them away from the religion. You know, either they will be killed by the oppression, or, you know, the propaganda and all of the things that go on, and then you start second guessing yourself, start doubting yourself. Even though you know what the truth is, but then you start having second thoughts. And this is why, what did they do? They changed their environment, got away from that environment. And for the Ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to change your environment doesn't mean, that you go like the monks and isolate yourself. For this ummah, that is only for the previous nations. For this ummah, it's to, understand the position, the status, and the honor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to keep reminding yourself of that, and to remind all of those around you of that, so that instead of the environment changing you, you're changing your environment from the inside out. This is also why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us in the Quran. He says to protect yourselves and your family. You start centrally and then you work out. Unfortunately, most of us try to work from outside in, and it doesn't work that way. So, when you have time, or rather when you make time, read Surah Kahf. Read the translation. Read the story of the people of the cave. And start looking at that story with everything that is going on around us today. And you start making the connections. Not only the connections of the problems that we're facing, but also the connections of the solutions to those problems. This is why, as I mentioned last week, when Imam Hussein al-Islam, when the situation came up for him, he didn't run away from the king. He took those who were strong enough with him to go and oppose the king. And we understand now why that sacrifice was so significant and so important. That because of that sacrifice, Islam remained intact and still remains intact for those who wish to see it. Because if he had given in, there would be no more Islam. Because if you look at the Islam of the rulers, of so-called Muslim rulers, and this isn't new. From the time of the end of the Khilafah on forward, the Islam of the rulers has always been whatever is convenient for them to maintain their rule. And however they can twist and turn the Quran and the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to their advantage. But the sadder part of that is if you look at the average Muslim these days, you see the same thing. Pick and choose what's convenient, so that nothing happens to my comfortable life. And this is why we see this fitna basically destroying so many people. Even though, and the worst form of oppression and destruction of a people is when they themselves don't know that they're being oppressed. We think, oh no, this is all good. It's so much easier to oppress somebody when he doesn't even realize he's being oppressed, because you've decided, you've changed the mindset to where, oh, this is normal, this is good. Because again, dajjaal, what will he do? when he comes. He will have with him hell, and he will have with him paradise. But it will be the opposites. And so when the mindset of the people have become opposite, where what is good is bad and what is bad is good, it's so much easier to control them. And again, if I was only speaking about non-Muslims, that would be not a big deal, because that's what we expect from them. But this is the normal, this has become the normal thinking, and I should say normal, this has become the common thinking amongst the Muslims. To the extent that even talking about religion becomes an issue. People get very uncomfortable. And all they want to talk about is, the dunya. And that's it. Part of that also is because when they start talking about religion, then they have that guilty conscience because, well, I'm falling short in this, and they don't, that hurts too much, so I don't even want to think about it. But again, this is all part of the fitna of dajjal. And if you read the verses of Surah Kahf, these are things that are being very systematically laid out so that someone who truly starts drawing the analogies, it forces him to think. If you look at the last 10 verses of Surah Kahf, and I was going to read the translation, but I won't, because of time. If you look at the last 10 verses, and you can go and read the translation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about punishment for those who disobey and don't follow the path. He also mentions, of course, if you look at the Quran, everything is balanced. And this is one of the miracles of the Quran. Night is mentioned as many times as day is mentioned. Dunya is mentioned as many times as the hereafter is mentioned. Everything's balanced. So when he talks about the punishment, he also talks about the reward. So he mentions this, but he gives that warning. Again, forcing us to think, forcing us to analyze everything that's around us. So then we should start realizing that if we go down this path, this will incur the wrath of Allah. But the part of the danger of the fitna of Dajjal is, again, the oppression where the oppressed doesn't even know he's being oppressed. Where the one has changed his aqidah, has changed his belief, and doesn't even realize it. He thinks now that, I'm a better Muslim. Before I was only praying 5 times a day, now I'm praying tahajjud and ishraq and everything else as well. But along with doing that, he's following an ideology which literally degrades the status of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He thinks, now I got a big beard, and I got my jubbah on, and I got my tasbih in my hand, and I can tell everybody shirk, bid'at, haram. The only 3 words I know. The other one, kafir and mushrik. The only other 2 words I know. And now I'm the best Muslim. See? Confirmed Jannati. Jannah is just waiting for me. I mean, this is, we laugh, but it's so sad that when we look at the ummah, this is the condition. And we accept this ideology without even looking at who's giving it to us. This is not the ideology that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with. This is not the ideology that the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam practiced. Even though when the way they twist the hadith and the Quran, they make you think that, yeah, this is. But again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us what? He told us to ponder. Pondering isn't just, I just look at it superficially, okay. Or I look at one thing in isolation. Because I can make any verse of the Quran say anything I want to if I look at it in isolation. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also orders the believers, not everybody, He says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. He says, enter Islam, fis-silmi kaffa, completely. Again, the verse starts off with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. He's not addressing anyone except the believers. The believers are already Muslim. They're already entered Islam. But He's ordering the believers. And may He accept us as believers. So He's ordering us to enter Islam completely. It's not like, well, I like this verse, so I'm going to, this is the one I'm going to pound on people. And leave everything else. Otherwise, if you start doing that, and when people do this, if we start doing this, then you get so many contradictions in the Quran, and there are no contradictions in the Quran. If I find a contradiction in the Quran, then that means there's a problem with the way I'm looking at it. Because there are none. If you look at everything in context, there are no contradictions in the Quran. But that last verse of Surah Kahf, which a lot of these people who want to belittle the status of Rasulullah ﷺ try to use, and again, using it out of context. قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders His beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam to say that I am a human being, and they translate it like you. Of course, for many people, like you means the same as you, which is not what it says. It says mithlukum, a similitude to you. And there's a huge difference in being, when you say a similitude to and the same as. They're not the same terms. Similitude means that there may be something in that there is something in common. We're all the creation of Allah. Rasulullah is the creation of Allah. But then immediately after making this part of the statement, because the command didn't end here, it didn't simply say, okay, just tell them that you're, similar to them. The rest of the statement, Yuha, ilahukum ilahun wahid. Except it is revealed to me that Allah is one. So that in itself distinguishes Him from everyone else, because none of us receive revelation. So that tells us He's not the same as us. But as far as this connection to Dajjal, because again, as we mentioned last week, when Dajjal comes, what will he say? He will claim to be God. He will claim to have power over life and death. To the extent that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give him the authority to waken some of the dead. He will claim, and his claim will vary depending on who he's talking to, just like a lot of these people's. They change what they're going to say depending on who they're talking to. This is why some people will say, oh, he is Christ. This is why in their literature he's mentioned as Antichrist. Anti doesn't mean against Christ. Anti in the Greek means imposter Christ. The one who will claim to be Isa alayhi salam. But in this verse, in قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us. He's having his Habib tell us this so that we understand that when Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is the perfect creation of that perfect creator, cannot be God or the Son of God or a deity or anything else as far as deity. When he's not that, then who is anybody else? And anyone who claims it is a liar. So again, that protects us from when he comes. And also should protect us from all of these other frauds who claim prophethood or who claim anything else. And there's no shortage of them. So again, when we look at these verses, the connection should be obvious, but the problem with most of us these days is that we try to, again, look at things in isolation. And the Quran is, the verses of the Quran are not something to be taken in isolation. This is where people deviate and get lost. Everything has its context. And so, in reality, as we said when we started talking about this subject, any verse of the Quran, if you really start diving deep into the meanings, should be enough, and especially should be enough to protect us from the fitna of dajjal. Any verse. But Rasulullah specified these verses because, again, when you look at the order and the reasoning, it shouldn't be very hard. And then you look at who Dajjal is and how his fitna will be spread and what fitna he will bring, then it's not very hard to make that connection as to why these verses for those who truly have the love of Allah and His Messenger in their hearts, because without that love, there is no understanding of anything. So for those who have that, why these verses serve as a direct protection from that fitna. But again, when we look at everything today, everything's gearing towards the coming of Dajjal, the coming of one man who can rule the world. Or rather, one man who can manipulate the people of the world. And this is what we see. The whole world has become enslaved. You look at the banking system. The system is designed to enslave us. And enslave us in such a way that people are enslaved and still don't realize that they're enslaved. In the old days of slavery, what happened? You went out, you were given a room, you were given food enough to keep you alive, and in the morning you went out, you worked the field, at night you came back, they fed you a little bit, and put you to sleep. And then the next day the same thing started all over again. What are people doing today? Literally the same thing. I've mentioned this before. I had a patient a few years ago. She came in one day, took me 15 minutes to calm her down just so she could talk to me, but she was crying uncontrollably. When I finally got her calmed down, that's 15 minutes after my nurse spent 15 minutes trying to get her calmed down. So it took us half an hour just to calm her down just so she could talk. And finally, when she could talk, she said that they foreclosed on her house. She was literally working 3 jobs just to make payments. She lost one of her jobs, which was a part-time job, and she could no longer make payments, and in no time they foreclosed. What is the difference between that and what was going on before? Other than before they knew they were slaves, and now we don't even know it. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, and may He fill our hearts with the love of His love and the love of His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his family, his companions, and all of those whom they love. Those who have not made sunnah, go and make sunnah.